You are 8 years old, standing inside a cathedral that towers so high above you it feels endless. The stone floor under your bare feet is so cold it almost burns. The air is thick with incense, and behind it you catch the sharp smell of sweat from the hundreds of nobles packed into the shadows. Fear hangs in the room. Your small hand shakes as a heavy ring, far too large for you, slides onto your finger. It was made for a grown woman, not a child, and it hangs loosely on your thin hand. Next to you stands a boy who can be no older than 13, his own hands trembling just as much. You are Agnes of France, and today, in the year 1180 AD, you are forced to become Empress of the Byzantine Empire by marrying a boy who will be dead within months. With the scrape of gold against bone, your childhood ends. Before we go further into these hidden stories of survival and hardship, if you enjoy discovering the side of history that rarely gets told, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I find it amazing that we can explore these ancient moments together, connected across the world through our curiosity about the past. Agnes's marriage contract had been signed years before she could even walk properly. Her future was decided by powerful men who measured her worth not by her own life, but by the dowries and territories her marriage could secure. Agnes was born in 1171 AD to King Louis VII of France and his third wife, Adele of Champagne. From her very first breath, she was treated as a political pawn. Her father, still haunted by his failures in the Second Crusade and desperate to maintain France's standing in a fractured medieval Europe, saw opportunity when the Byzantine Empire suggested an alliance through marriage. Louis VII had lived through the consequences of his disastrous marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. After their separation, Eleanor married Henry II of England, creating the Angevin Empire, a vast power that threatened to overwhelm France. By marrying Agnes into the Byzantine court, Louis hoped to open a second front against the English, pulling their attention away from French borders. His daughter's childhood became the cost of this strategy. The negotiations that sealed Agnes's fate took place at the palace on the Ile de la Cité in Paris. There, French courtiers met Byzantine ambassadors to decide her future without once considering her wishes. The Byzantine envoys arrived in dazzling style, carrying treasures that showed off the empire's legendary wealth, silks that shimmered like captured sunlight, spices that filled entire halls with their scent, and illuminated manuscripts whose golden letters glittered in the candlelight. Emperor Manuel Komnenos of Byzantium needed this alliance. His empire, though still splendid, was under pressure. The Seljuk Turks were pushing on his eastern frontiers. Provincial governors were growing more independent, and Italian merchant republics were slowly taking control of Byzantine trade. A marriage to France offered military help and much-needed political legitimacy. The official betrothal ceremony was held in the Royal Chapel in Paris. There, 7-year-old Agnes stood beside ambassadors speaking for a groom she had never seen. They placed a tiny crown on her head, decorated with pearls from the Black Sea. It was so heavy, it forced her small neck to bend under its weight, while clerks recorded the legal details that would define her life. Church law required her consent, but asking a 7-year-old child to approve such a fate was nothing more than a formality. Agnes spent her last year in France preparing for her new role. Tutors from Constantinople were sent to teach her Greek, the language of her future empire. She practiced in cold palace chambers, her lessons echoing through the halls while the winter wind rattled the diamond-paned windows. She learned to eat with golden utensils, to move with the controlled grace expected of Byzantine empresses, and to recognize the icons of Orthodox faith that would cover every wall of her new home. Religious instruction was considered essential, shaping her mind for a destiny she had never chosen. As the differences between Western and Eastern Christianity could cause problems for a Latin princess entering an Orthodox empire, French priests carefully explained the Filioque controversy. They described how the Western Church believed the Holy Spirit came from both the Father and the Son, while the Eastern Church believed the Spirit came from the Father alone. These arguments were far too complex for a child to grasp, but they would shape every religious ritual in the years ahead. Agnes also had to prepare physically, since life at the Byzantine court was nothing like the relatively relaxed customs of French nobility. She was trained to bow deeply before icons, to sit motionless during long ceremonies, and to lower her voice to the soft, controlled tones expected of imperial women. Court dance masters drilled her in the slow, formal steps of palace dances, while seamstresses stitched miniature gowns from heavy silks so she could practice moving gracefully in clothing that weighed far more than anything she had ever worn. By 1179 AD, Constantinople projected a power very different from the rough stone castles of Western Europe. Here, silk replaced wool, marble shone instead of timber, and the imperial palace stretched across 7 hills like a glittering city within a city. Yet beneath the wealth, the empire was beginning to crack. Emperor Manuel the Sir Comnenos had died the year before, leaving the throne to his son Alexios II, a boy too young to rule an empire that stretched from the Danube to the deserts of Anatolia. The journey to her new home took months, carrying 8-year-old Agnes across changing landscapes. She left the familiar fields of northern France, passed through the vineyards of Burgundy, where autumn leaves painted the ground in red and gold, crossed mountain passes where snow fell even in May, and struggled to breathe in the thin alpine air. She traveled down the Italian peninsula, where the ruins of Rome whispered of empires long gone. Then came the sea crossing from Venice to Constantinople, a nightmare for a child who had never seen deep water. Mediterranean storms rocked their galley like a toy, drenching the deck and leaving everyone sick. For 3 days, Agnes lay in her cabin unable to eat, while French envoys argued over whether to turn back or press on. When the morning mist finally lifted to reveal Constantinople, Agnes rushed to the rail to see the legendary city. It looked like something from the illuminated manuscripts she had studied in France. Domes and towers glowed in the sunlight. The Golden Horn curved into the city like a silver blade, and the waters were crowded with ships from every nation: Venetian galleys heavy with spices, Genoese traders stacked with precious metals, and fishing boats spilling silver fish onto their decks. The Byzantine palace itself stunned the French delegation. Unlike the fortress-like castles of France, the imperial palace spread out openly across its 7 hills. White marble columns rose into the air. Courtyards sparkled with fountains, and vast gardens stretched into the distance, filled with roses and jasmine, carried on the breeze. Agnes's first meeting with Emperor Alexios II took place in the throne room. a hall so large that even whispers echoed like thunder. The boy emperor sat on the throne of Constantine, his legs dangling above the floor, the purple imperial diadem slipping over his eyes. His silk robes pooled around his thin frame, making him look like a child dressed for a masquerade, following court ritual. Both children recited memorized phrases in Greek before hundreds of courtiers. Agnes spoke so softly, her words were almost lost in the vast hall, while Alexios repeated his lines just as stiffly. Neither dared to look at the other, their eyes fixed instead on officials who signaled when to speak. A lavish banquet followed. One course after another appeared. Wines from Cyprus and Rhodes, fruits preserved in honey from Trebizond, and rare delicacies with names foreign to the French attendants. Agnes and Alexios sat side by side at the high table, overwhelmed by the noise, languages, and stares of an audience judging their every move. The wedding itself went against every natural instinct of the children. Agnes wore a robe of Byzantine silk that dragged across the floor like spilled wine. The crown placed on her head slid down over her eyes, so heavy it ached against her skull. Alexios, pale and weakened by illness, swayed unsteadily at her side. Neither child understood the Greek prayers of the Orthodox rite. Agnes had been taught when to nod and when to extend her hand, but the Byzantine service was nothing like the simple vows of Latin Christianity. Instead of straightforward promises, the ceremony was filled with elaborate symbolism and theological references far beyond a child's understanding. The priest placed golden Stephana crowns on both bride and groom, joining them with a single ribbon that symbolized their spiritual unity. For grown adults, the ritual carried deep meaning. For two frightened children, it was just another mystery they could not yet understand. Palace musicians played instruments unlike anything Agnes had ever heard. The soft, eerie notes of wooden flutes blended with the clatter of castanets and the deep pounding of drums stretched with skins over carved frames of exotic wood. The music gave the entire scene an otherworldly quality, as if she had stepped into a dream, yet the heavy crown pressing into her skull reminded her that this was no dream. It was real, and it could never be undone. In the incense-filled air, whispers flowed through the crowd like poison. Everyone knew that true power in Constantinople did not rest with the boy emperor Alexios II, but with his cousin, Andronikos I Komnenos. Nearly 60 years old, Andronikos had lived a scandalous life, exiled many times for rebellions and affairs. But the death of Emperor Manuel had opened the door for his return. Now, while two children were paraded as emperor and empress, Andronikos plotted to kill one and take possession of the other. Even a child could feel the tension that followed him. Servants stiffened when he appeared, avoiding eye contact. Courtiers, who laughed freely a moment before, fell silent at the sound of his footsteps. Even the palace cats, normally bold rulers of the marble halls, fled at the sight of his shadow. Agnes's wedding night was nothing like the frightening stories whispered in village markets. Instead, she lay in a vast bed larger than a peasant's home, while Alexios slept far across on the other side. Both were uneasy, too young to understand what was expected of them. Court doctors still examined Agnes each month for signs of womanhood, though everyone knew those changes were still years away. Yet nobles bowed before her as if she were already a full empress, even though she sometimes forgot to bow back. Around her, the strange figures of palace eunuchs Smooth-faced men with quiet voices and powerful connections watched carefully. They measured her potential value in the struggles for influence that shaped life inside the court. That life revolved around endless ceremonies. Each day began before dawn, with prayers while stars still glittered over the domes of Constantinople. Morning devotions left her knees sore from kneeling on marble, and evening vespers stretched until wax burned low in golden sconces. Between these bookends of prayer, her hours filled with lessons designed to turn a French princess into a Byzantine empress. Greek lessons continued daily, though the palace dialect sounded very different from the classical Greek Agnes's tutors had taught in France. She stumbled over verb forms that had no Latin equivalent, and her foreign accent frustrated her teachers. Writing lessons were just as demanding. Byzantine scribes practiced calligraphy so elaborate that even the simplest letters became miniature works of art. It took her hours of practice just to form the basics. Court etiquette required an even more delicate education. Agnes was drilled in the countless small gestures and tones that communicated status without words. She learned to match her walking speed to the rank of those beside her, to adjust her voice precisely depending on who she addressed, and to manage her facial expressions to reflect the expected emotions at each occasion. Palace officials corrected her posture, voice, and movements until every gesture became a performance. Religious training formed another central part of her preparation. She had to learn Orthodox theology well enough to take part in the ceremonies that marked every important moment of imperial life. Eastern Christianity was not simply Western Catholicism with different rituals. Icons stood at the center of worship, painted saints who served as windows into the divine. Agnes memorized how to identify dozens of holy figures: Saint Basil in his bishop's robes, Saint Chrysostom with his golden tongue, and martyrs whose suffering earned them places of honor in heaven. She practiced prayers in Greek, the foreign syllables stumbling off her tongue, while palace chaplains explained theological ideas rooted in ancient philosophies she had never known in France. The empire Agnes had entered, however, was already a shadow of its former glory. Once, the eagles of Byzantium had flown over lands stretching from Italy to the Euphrates River. By the time Agnes arrived, the empire struggled even to control Anatolia. The Fourth Crusade was still in the future, but no one in Constantinople could have imagined that Western Christians themselves would one day sack the city. For now, the empire faced relentless pressure. Seljuk Turks pushing from the east, and Norman adventurers carving out kingdoms in territories once held by Byzantium. What the empire desperately needed was strong leadership, skilled generals, and a sense of unity. Instead, it had a dying boy on the throne and a French child whose main task was to look solemn during ceremonies. Economic decay made the situation even worse. Decades of costly wars and endless diplomatic payoffs had drained the treasury. Once famed for its wealth, the imperial coffers now struggled just to pay the guards and government clerks. Provincial governors sent in taxes irregularly, if at all, keeping revenues for themselves. Trade, once the foundation of Byzantine prosperity, now served the interests of foreign powers. Venetian and Genoese merchants dominated the most profitable routes, while Byzantine traders were pushed into providing raw materials. The empire that had once ruled Mediterranean commerce now looked like a client state, dependent on the very Westerners it once despised. Meanwhile, Alexios II grew weaker by the day. His coughing fits echoed through the palace corridors, and servants hurried to hide the blood-stained silk handkerchiefs he left behind. Agnes, still young enough to play with ivory dolls dressed in tiny court costumes, sat beside her husband's sickbed, holding his burning hand, while physicians burned herbs and muttered prayers in languages she couldn't understand. The doctors themselves reflected Byzantium's vast cultural mix. Greek physicians trained in classical traditions argued with Arab doctors, whose knowledge of anatomy and medicine far surpassed Western Europe. Jewish healers, tolerated despite prejudice, brought diagnostic skills honed in the hospitals of Cordoba and Baghdad. Their treatments ranged from bloodletting with silver lancets to exotic herbal remedies brought across continents for Constantinople's markets. None of it worked. The boy emperor's decline opened space for ambition. Courtiers who once bowed respectfully to Alexios began seeking out other possible heirs. Palace guards carried out their duties with less enthusiasm. Servants hesitated before obeying commands, wary of following orders that might soon be overturned. Even the palace cats seemed restless, drifting into new corners of the complex as though sensing an oncoming storm. Agnes noticed the shifts. She was only a child, but children often see what adults overlook. She realized some officials no longer appeared at Alexios's morning audiences, while others attended more frequently than protocol demanded. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms, and courtiers, who once treated her with elaborate formality, now offered only hurried bows, their impatience thinly veiled. Through it all, Andronikos moved like smoke through the palace. He appeared suddenly in unexpected places. His presence felt even when he wasn't visible. Servants bent under his gaze. Courtiers bowed too deeply, and fear followed wherever he walked. Agnes learned to recognize the sound of his footsteps in the corridor outside her chambers, measured, steady, belonging to a man utterly certain of his right to claim whatever he desired. He began speaking to her more often as Alexios's health declined. His voice was calm, persuasive, the tone of someone who had always been obeyed. At first, his conversations seemed harmless. Questions about her comfort, her lessons, her adjustment to palace life. They sounded like the kindly interest of an older relative, but there was nothing innocent in his eyes. Andronikos often approached Agnes with the air of a caring relative. He asked about her health, her studies, and how she was adjusting to life at the Byzantine court. To anyone watching, he appeared warm and protective, yet his eyes stayed cold, a detail Agnes noticed, even if she couldn't fully explain her unease. These exchanges always took place in public areas, where his behavior looked entirely proper. Still, Agnes sensed something hidden beneath the surface. Over time, his visits became more frequent and more personal. He began joining her afternoon walks in the palace gardens, guiding her through rows of flowers and pointing out details of the buildings. He explained their history with polished skill, turning complicated events into engaging stories about the empire's past victories and losses. Agnes, still very young, found herself enjoying these lessons even while a quiet anxiety lingered. Then the gifts started. At first, they were small tokens: an ivory comb carved with classical scenes, a silk scarf from one of the empire's finest weaving centers, illuminated prayer books that had been crafted by artists whose work adorned the private libraries of popes and emperors. Each gift came with a short note written in elegant Greek calligraphy, evidence of his privileged education. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted as Alexios II's health deteriorated. Servants who once hurried to meet Agnes's requests began delaying. Guards who used to bow deeply now offered only the briefest nods. Even the eunuchs, usually masters of courtly courtesy, looked through her instead of at her. Their attention had already turned toward the next ruler. Andronikos' presence grew everywhere. He seemed to glide through the palace like smoke, appearing suddenly in doorways, his confidence unmistakable. Servants avoided him, and courtiers bowed with exaggerated respect that revealed their fear. Agnes learned to recognize his footsteps outside her chambers, steady and deliberate, as if announcing that nothing stood beyond his reach. When he spoke to her, his voice carried the weight of authority, calm and commanding, as though obedience were simply natural. Palace life itself began reorganizing around him. Morning audiences with the young emperor became shorter and more informal, while meetings with leading officials shifted closer to Andronikos' apartments. Guards adjusted their patrols to secure the areas where he spent his time. Even dining reflected the shift. Better wines and finer dishes were served at his tables. Agnes's lessons also changed. New subjects appeared, tailored to prepare her for what lay ahead. She studied court ceremonies tied to imperial succession, learned prayers for the dying, and was trained in funeral rituals. Her Greek vocabulary lessons centered on words like death, inheritance, and remarriage. For a child of 12, the meaning of these changes was unclear, but to adults around her, the message was obvious. The empire was preparing for Alexios' death, and what would follow. That moment came in September of 1183 AD. Alexios II died. The official record named fever as the cause, though rumors of foul play quickly spread. Agnes, just 12 years old, and formally recognized as the Dowager Empress of Byzantium, stood beside his golden sarcophagus in Hagia Sophia as priests chanted the funeral rites. The vast dome loomed above the mourners, its mosaics glittering like watchful eyes. Candle smoke drifted upward, making painted saints appear to shift and move, while the sweet scent of myrrh could not fully mask the tension in the air. Despite the empire's political weakness, the ceremony was a masterpiece of spectacle. Hundreds of candles turned the cathedral into a sea of flickering light. Golden mosaics shimmered. Frescoes glowed as if alive, and incense filled the space like its own atmosphere. The choir's voices rose in harmonies that felt unearthly. Agnes wore mourning clothes of black silk, which absorbed the light and gave her the look of a shadow moving through the grandeur. A fine widow's veil draped over her head like captured mist. Pearls, the jewels chosen for imperial mourning, hung from her attire like frozen tears. Palace officials had drilled her in the gestures of a grieving empress, though her emotions as a child were far too tangled to fit into ceremony. The body of Alexios lay in state, dressed in purple silk woven with golden patterns, celebrating victories over long-dead enemies. On his head rested a crown set with gems collected from every corner of the known world. One by one, mourners filed past the sarcophagus according to their rank in the rigid Byzantine hierarchy. At the front were church officials in splendid vestments embroidered with holy scenes, that caught the candlelight, glowing as though alive. Civil officials followed the church leaders in solemn procession, their robes dyed in colors that displayed their ranks. Behind them came the military commanders, dressed in ceremonial armor, so highly polished that the walls and lights of the cathedral gleamed in their reflection. Andronikos wasted no time securing his rule. Only days after Alexios II's funeral, he declared himself emperor and announced his plan to marry the young widow, Agnes, who had spent her short life either promised to or married to a boy her own age, now faced marriage to a man nearly 60, old enough to be her grandfather. The Byzantine court, long accustomed to marriages driven by politics rather than personal feelings, accepted the decision without protest. To them, this was simply another step in Andronikos's relentless rise. The speed of the transition showed how carefully it had been prepared. Official proclamations of the new emperor's succession appeared across Constantinople at the same moment. Palace guards, who had sworn loyalty to Alexios II, shifted their allegiance smoothly, as though rehearsed. Government administrators discovered that their duties continued without interruption, as if the change of ruler were little more than a new set of decorations inside the palace. For Agnes, the days after the funeral brought growing isolation. Courtiers, who once courted her favor, now directed all their attention to Andronikos. Servants carried out their work with a mechanical air, no longer eager to please her. Even her tutors altered her lessons. Instead of focusing on her talents and interests, they now introduced subjects meant to prepare her for adult responsibilities she was far from ready to shoulder. The official announcement came during a great banquet in the palace hall. Hundreds of candles lit frescoes depicting imperial victories of centuries past. At the high table, still in her mourning black, Agnes sat as Andronikos rose to speak. His voice filled the vast chamber as he outlined his vision for the empire. New military campaigns, fresh conquests, restored glory. Then, almost casually, he declared his intention to marry the widow of the late emperor. The nobles applauded, though the sound was polite rather than enthusiastic. Their carefully arranged expressions suggested approval while hiding whatever doubts they may have harbored. Agnes kept her composure, as court training demanded, but those who looked closely could see her hands trembling slightly as she lifted her wine cup. Her opinion was never sought. In the medieval world, marriage was a contract between families, a tool for politics and property, not a matter of personal choice. The fact that she was a child and he was a man in his 60s caused no scandal in the Byzantine court. Agnes brought value as a link to the French royal house. Andronikos needed her to legitimize his seizure of the throne. The political arithmetic made their union unavoidable. Canon law technically required both bride and groom to give consent, but in practice, that consent was flexible. If Agnes did not object in public, the church would assume her agreement. Any private protest could be dismissed as the nervousness of a young girl approaching marriage. Clergy, who might have questioned the arrangement, either supported Andronikos for political reasons or chose silence over confrontation. Preparations for the wedding began immediately. Unlike her earlier marriage to Alexios II, which had been framed as a solemn dynastic union, this ceremony carried the atmosphere of conquest. Her gowns were sewn in deep purple and gold, the colors of imperial power. Courtiers debated how to design a ceremony that would both celebrate a wedding and confirm Andronikos' takeover. This time, Agnes was more directly involved. She was old enough to be consulted about details of music, decorations, and guest lists, yet her choices were limited by political needs. Every decision had to reflect imperial legitimacy and project strength abroad, where foreign rulers watched closely for signs of weakness. Church officials, too, faced delicate questions. They had to design a rite that united an imperial widow, still only a child, to a man whose claim to authority partly rested on making her his wife. Orthodox canon law did contain precedents for remarriage of empresses and for unions with large age gaps, but few situations combined these elements in so controversial a way. But this marriage tested even the most flexible interpretations of tradition. The unique combination of factors, child bride, imperial widow, usurpation cloaked as legitimacy, forced church officials into careful improvisation. Agnes drifted through those weeks as if suspended between two lives. Palace routines continued around her, yet everything shifted quietly toward Andronikos. Servants packed her belongings without asking what she wished to keep, moving her from the rooms she had shared with Alexios to apartments designated for the emperor's wife. These new chambers were spacious and magnificent, adorned with silk tapestries of mythological scenes. Yet to Agnes, they felt like a gilded cage, designed to enclose and display something precious, not to shelter a human being. The apartments overlooked the Bosphorus, where fleets from across the known world passed in constant motion. Gardens below bloomed with rare plants, tended by expert gardeners, and fountains sent out endless melodies of falling water. Officials explained that these accommodations reflected her elevated status, but Agnes quickly understood their real purpose. The placement of guards, polite but ever watchful, restricted her freedom. Servants, attentive to her smallest needs before she spoke them, seemed more like informants than caretakers. The wedding came swiftly. In October 1183, less than a month after Alexios II's funeral, Agnes wore a crown, once set on the heads of empresses long dead, its weight of pearls and sapphires pressing hard against her temples. She walked the long aisle of Hagia Sophia, a child moving toward her fate, while Andronikos waited at the altar in imperial purple. His beard, streaked with gray, had been carefully trimmed. His dark eyes followed her with a satisfaction that made her stomach twist. The cathedral's silence felt charged, heavy with tension rather than reverence. Silk banners hung above, stitched with scenes of Byzantine triumph over foreign enemies and domestic rivals alike. Hundreds of candles turned the vast dome into a firmament of fire, their flames mirrored by mosaics of gold. Incense hung so thick in the air, it seemed to alter the atmosphere itself, veiling the space in clouds of sanctity that could not disguise the transaction taking place beneath. This time, Agnes knew enough Greek to follow the ceremony. Understanding brought no relief. The priests chanted blessings over a union consecrated by necessity, not by nature. When her turn came, her vow emerged as barely more than a whisper. Andronikos spoke his loudly, his voice carrying the assurance of a man claiming what he had long desired. The ring he placed upon her finger fit properly, sized for her 12-year-old hand, yet its weight pressed heavier than the oversized band she had worn years before as Alexios's child bride. Then came the golden Stephana, crowns bound by a ribbon meant to symbolize unity. The ritual proclaimed partnership, but to anyone with eyes, the reality was domination. Palace officials had drilled Agnes in her gestures and responses. She moved with perfect accuracy, but her motions lacked life, like those of an automaton carrying out commands. The wedding guests represented every stratum of Byzantine society. High clergy stood closest to the altar, their jeweled vestments flashing like fire against the cathedral's mosaics. Generals in ceremonial armor shimmered with reflected candlelight, their presence a reminder that legitimacy required control of the sword. Civil administrators filled the ranks in robes dyed in subtle gradations of purple, each shade carefully marking place within the hierarchy. Their attendance served one purpose: to witness and thereby to affirm that Andronikos had taken not only the throne, but the imperial bride as well. The ceremony gave way to the feast. The palace's great hall was transformed with banners of silk and plates of precious metals. Servants carried in dish after dish, a parade of delicacies drawn from every corner of the empire. To foreign eyes, it was a vision of imperial wealth and power. To Andronikos, it was a performance of legitimacy. Agnes sat at his side, touching little of the food before her. Conversations swirled around her, in languages she half understood. At intervals, Andronikos laid his hand over hers, a gesture that looked tender from a distance. To Agnes, it felt like a shackle. The feast itself was designed as a grand act of political theater, using food as a tool of diplomacy. Each dish was carefully chosen to honor different groups whose loyalty Andronikos needed in order to strengthen his rule. Wines from the empire's vineyards displayed the productivity of lands still firmly under Constantinople's control, while rare spices proved that trade routes with faraway partners remained open despite political turmoil. The order of courses followed long-standing imperial traditions, deliberately tying the new reign to centuries of established custom. Entertainment carried just as much meaning as the food. Performances were meant to display imperial power while sending subtle messages to the foreign ambassadors in attendance, who would later describe what they had witnessed to their courts abroad. Musicians blended familiar Byzantine melodies with elements borrowed from Western Europe, a deliberate show of cultural sophistication and diplomatic awareness. Dancers acted out choreographed stories of imperial victories, retelling battles whose details had long faded into history, but still symbolized strength and dominance. Agnes watched all of this with the distant awareness of someone trapped in a role she did not choose. She smiled when required, exactly as she had been trained, but her expressions were stiff, the rehearsed movements of a child following instructions. Those who came forward to congratulate her received polite answers, though every word had been carefully practiced. The wedding night marked the harsh reality of what marriage truly meant for Agnes. At only 12 years old, she was barely beginning to understand her own body, let alone the expectations placed on her as a wife. Andronikos, hardened by years of exile, political scheming, and survival, approached the consummation with the same cold calculation he brought to ruling. For Agnes, the experience was a brutal lesson in how powerless she truly was. What should have been personal and intimate became instead an act of control, showing her that even her body was now a political tool. Months earlier, palace doctors had monitored her closely, recording her development in clinical detail to ensure the marriage could be validated. both legally and religiously. Their reports, stored in the imperial archives, reduced her existence to measurements and observations, treating her like an asset to be managed rather than a human being. The chamber prepared for her wedding night carried layers of symbolism. Silk tapestries showed mythical marriages between gods and mortals. Golden vases overflowed with flowers, whose scents were chosen to suggest sensuality. Rose petals covered the floor and bed, while crystal containers of precious oils were arranged nearby to enhance physical intimacy. Everything in the room was designed to merge fertility, desire, and imperial power into one carefully staged setting. The morning after, palace physicians examined her once again, their confirmation of consummation serving as the official stamp of approval on what politics had already demanded. For Agnes, the experience shattered any lingering illusions about marriage. What had once been wrapped in fantasy now stood bare as political reality. Her title, her possessions, and even her own body all belonged to her husband. Life as Andronikos' empress was entirely different from her childish first marriage to Alexios II, where Alexios had shared toys and stories with her. Andronikos demanded her full participation in the weighty rituals of imperial power. She appeared at diplomatic receptions, where she smiled and nodded despite understanding only half of what was said. She sat in on military councils, where generals outlined campaigns she could barely follow. Her presence was required everywhere, but her opinions were never asked. Most of all, she learned how to read her husband's moods, adjusting her behavior constantly to avoid provoking his famous temper. Andronikos expected not just ceremonial obedience, but also intimate companionship, using their marriage to display his legitimacy as emperor. Agnes learned to anticipate his desires in conversation, entertainment, and physical closeness, and to mask her unease with an appearance of enthusiasm. Life at court demanded constant performance, with every gesture meant to convince the world of harmony between them. Her daily schedule was reshaped to serve her husband's political goals. In the mornings, she attended administrative meetings, a living reminder of dynastic continuity. In the afternoons, she sat in on military councils, a symbol of unity for the empire. In the evenings, she appeared at receptions, smiling graciously for foreign dignitaries, whose reports would shape international opinion. Her education was directed entirely by Andronikos. She studied advanced Greek, tailored to diplomatic and military vocabulary, not to literature or philosophy. Religious instruction emphasized prayers for victory and ceremonies glorifying imperial power. History lessons focused on examples of empresses who had supported their husbands in politics, never on women who lived for themselves. What had once seemed optional during her marriage to Alexios became compulsory under Andronikos. Daily prayers stretched from dawn until nightfall, while endless court functions filled her remaining hours. Even meals, recreation, and rest were organized around her husband's preferences. Agnes, of France, had entered a new life with no escape. Andronikos's reign, however, quickly revealed the same instability that had brought him to power. His military campaigns, announced with pomp and promises, achieved little. They drained the treasury, weakened the army, and exposed Byzantine vulnerability to enemies who had once kept their distance. Andronikos's domestic policies turned out to be just as damaging as his military failures. His decisions alienated the empire's long-standing allies, yet did little to build new support. Far worse, his deep paranoia led him to see enemies everywhere. Executions and exiles became routine, wiping out not only genuine conspirators, but also loyal supporters who might have helped him. Agnes had a front row seat to this unraveling. She attended banquets where ambassadors cloaked threats in polite words. She sat through tense council meetings where advisors delivered desperate reports of lost battles and shrinking borders. She was present on the day news arrived that Crusader armies from the west had captured several key Byzantine cities. Their Christian banners did not mean protection for Eastern Christians, but conquest. Inside the palace, Andronikos' paranoia poisoned daily life. Servants who had worked faithfully for generations were suddenly accused of treason. Guards who had proven their loyalty one day were suspected of betrayal the next. Even Agnes had to control her every word and expression, knowing that a simple question or offhand remark could be twisted into evidence of sedition. As his insecurity deepened, Andronikos clung more tightly to Agnes. She was kept constantly at his side during public events, displayed beside the throne as living proof of his legitimate right to rule. In private, he pressed her with questions about her interactions with courtiers and servants. Letters to her family in France were read, censored, or blocked entirely. Agnes responded by withdrawing inward, developing the ability to appear attentive while keeping her true thoughts locked away. By 1184 and 1185 AD, the empire's collapse was obvious. Each month brought new disasters. Provincial governors declared independence, knowing Constantinople could not stop them. Rich trade routes that had fueled the empire for centuries fell into the hands of Italian city-states and the Seljuks, and in the capital itself, popular anger boiled over as ordinary citizens, exhausted by misrule, reached their breaking point. Agnes felt like a passenger trapped on a sinking ship, able to see disaster coming, but powerless to steer. She continued to play her part, attending ceremonies and church services. Even as the empire disintegrated around her, servants fled or joined the opposition. Guards who once saluted her now looked at her calculatingly, already deciding whether loyalty to the imperial family was worth their lives. The end came in September 1185 AD. Crowds stormed the palace, their fury echoing through the halls as glass shattered, wood splintered, and voices rose in the terrifying roar of revolt. Guards abandoned their posts, while servants barricaded themselves in hidden rooms. Andronikos' death was as savage as his reign had been cruel. The mob caught him, trying to escape the city. Dragged through the very streets where he once paraded in glory, he was beaten, humiliated, and torn apart by people who had endured too much. Agnes did not see his final moments, though she could hear the chaos from inside the palace. At just 14 years old, she was widowed for the second time. 2 imperial marriages had given her nothing but exploitation and trauma. The new emperor, Isaac the St. Angelus, had to decide her fate. On one hand, killing her would erase a dangerous link to the fallen regime. On the other, she was a French princess, and harming her risked alienating Western Europe at a time when allies were desperately needed. The solution came through diplomacy. Her half-brother, Philip II Augustus, who now ruled France, negotiated for her release. Months passed, while talks dragged on, during which Agnes lived in near house arrest. Her life hung on political bargaining, treated less as that of a young woman than as a pawn to be moved on the board of statecraft. Finally, in 1186 AD, she left Constantinople. At just 15, she ended her Byzantine chapter, sailing from the Golden Horn and watching the city fade into the horizon. The girl who had arrived in 1179 AD was gone. What remained was someone shaped by 7 years of loss, survival, and forced adaptation. Her return to France was both a homecoming and an exile. She no longer fully belonged there. She spoke Greek more fluently than French, understood Orthodox theology better than Catholic doctrine, and carried herself with the formal bearing of a Byzantine empress rather than the lighter manners of French nobility. King Philip II Augustus welcomed her, formally but uneasily. Her presence reminded everyone of an alliance that had brought little benefit, while placing a royal princess in danger and disgrace. She was given lands, income, and the courtesy title of Dowager Empress, ensuring comfort but little influence. Agnes never married again, despite proposals from ambitious nobles. Whether that was her choice or her family's decision is unclear. What is certain is that she lived quietly, managing her estates and devoting herself to religious life. She died around 1220 AD, having lived long enough to hear of the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 AD. That catastrophe, which permanently shattered the Byzantine Empire, must have struck her deeply. She had walked those marble corridors, seen its mosaics gleam, and felt both the grandeur and fragility of its power. Agnes's life stands as a stark lesson in the brutal politics of medieval marriage. Her childhood was spent as currency in dynastic bargaining. Her adolescence was sacrificed to ambition. Her adulthood was marked by trauma that served no greater purpose. Modern readers may recoil at the thought, but the logic of her world has not fully disappeared. Today, child marriage and human trafficking still exploit the young, justified in new terms, but equally blind to dignity and choice. The cathedral, where 8-year-old Agnes had first worn that heavy wedding ring, was itself destroyed during the Fourth Crusade. Its columns were toppled, its mosaics shattered, like her childhood, broken by forces beyond her control. And yet, in history's shadows, one can still see the image of that frightened child at the altar, her tiny hand trembling beneath a ring meant for an empire, a burden she carried, in one form or another, until her final breath released her from a life defined by promises no one ever intended to keep.